Gerard McMahon, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good afternoon, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
No, thank you for giving up 45 minutes now every time to have a little chat. And it's something. It's a topic that I've asked you to contribute to Sportsmith a couple of times before. So this is a kind of audio version. It gives you a little bit of gives both a bit of an opportunity to kind of get into the weeds of this particular topic that we'll get into around activation, pre-activation. I'm sure everyone out there has heard these terms, maybe don't quite understand where they've come from and what they actually mean and why people are doing certain things, what they think they're doing, what it's actually doing, all those kind of good topics. So, but before we dive in, would you mind just giving us a bit of a background on you, please?
Yeah, no worries. I suppose professional background. Currently, I'm a lecturer in Ulster University. Pretty much academic background, undergrad degree at Ulster University, master's in sports physiology, Liverpool John Moores, PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University in the neuromuscular tendon adaptations to resistance training. Spent close to 6 years at the Sports Institute Northern Ireland as well. Aside from those professional positions and academic training, I've worked with elite athletes for 20 years now. 3 Olympics, 3 Paralympics, a couple of Commonwealth Games, multiple European World Championships, World Cups and stuff with different individual and team sports as well. So I've always been at the side of just the academic stuff. I've always worked with elite athletes as well. So basically getting to put my theories into practice sort of thing and see what happens with them as well. So I've been very fortunate in my career to get those experiences.
Any athletes at the Olympics coming up?
This is my first Olympics in 12 years that I'm not. I'm currently working with the men's and women's senior Irish cricket team squads, and also the head of performance for Down Camogie in the GAA as well. So no, this is the first Olympics yet in the last 4 that I won't have been working with somebody. So I will be able to sit back with my feet up and thoroughly enjoy it for once.
Actually enjoy it for once with no pressure.
Yeah, that's it.
Good stuff. Well, let's dive in, because I think for me personally, and based on the uptake and the interest in the articles that you've already written for Sportsmith, this is a super interesting interesting topic for our audience of strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists, rehabbers, physios, etc. So before we start, let's kind of set the scene and do maybe the basics, but maybe not the basics. What does muscle activation actually mean? What does it mean from your experience and knowledge, but how does that differ from what people think it means?
Okay, so really the neuromuscular system, muscle activation is pretty much its bread and butter function or role. If I want to describe all the electrochemical processes that are involved with it, it sounds super complex and, lots of nice, fancy, long words in that, but actually muscle activation is a very, very simple function for the neuromuscular system to carry out. But really, if you talk about muscle activation, and if you actually look at how it's quantified and what it's actually quantifying, muscle activation is the combination of motor unit recruitment and also motor unit firing rate as well, or number of action potentials discharged by a motor unit. So that's essentially it. Our motor unit recruitment is where we gradually, according to the Henman size principle, depending on how much force you want to create, we recruit generally larger and larger motor units, and then the firing rates, like I said, is the amount of action potentials discharges that come with that. And between the two of those processes, they control force levels, and combined together, they are muscle activation. If you're talking about what people understand it to be, that's a little bit different. I doubt they know that that's how muscle activation is quantified. In fact, it's one of the first questions I ask people is, what is muscle activation? They will probably throw out a bit of technical jargon and a few of those neuromuscular terms and stuff, but they don't actually understand that it's in the way it's quantified and what it actually reflects as a measure. Also, just because the word activation is in there, they sort of draw parallels between it and post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement, which are completely different things. So I think there is general confusion both around in terms of what it is, how it's measured, what it reflects, and also what specific processes you're referring to as well.
How has this term found its way? I mean, we'll talk about the kind of pre-activation and like pre-warm-up things that people do and how this has been kind of lumped together. But why, from your experience and just, I suppose, you're wondering, why has this term found its way into the kind of common language when clearly the explanation of actually what it is doesn't actually seem to come together?
Yeah, I've had this conversation a few times with different practitioners and academics from all over the world. They're also not entirely sure. But a couple of us think it may have originated from the sports medicine world, potentially, where you have either a clinical population or potentially an athletic population that's injured or rehabbing. And there are, with some of those conditions, issues with muscle activation. But the problem with taking it from the context that is used in those populations and the way that it's being referred to there, to move that to a healthy population, when you're warming up athletes that there's no issues or anything wrong with, it's completely superfluous. It's unnecessary to go down that route because they're healthy. So I think it's the practitioners have become seduced by the language as much as anything. It sounds really fancy. It sounds as if it's really impactful. But like I said before, activation is a bread and butter thing that your neuromuscular systems do. If you want to sprint, you activate muscles. If you want to scratch your backside, you activate muscles. If you want to blink, you're activating muscles. It's literally, it is the bog standard function of the neuromuscular system. So I think it came probably from a clinical world, sports medicine world, filtered in, but it's out of context because a lot of people use it with healthy athletes when it's completely unnecessary. And again, that sort of neurophysiology terminology sounds really good. Maybe just people want to impress either the athletes or coaches or people who they're working with as well. It's throw those sciencey terms about. But again, when they do that and you're talking to somebody who knows the area, it just becomes fairly meaningless and just really a bit of a word salad altogether. But we do see it in a lot of different, we've seen it appear in, for example, the ramp protocol for a warm-up, raise heart rate, activate, mobilize, potentiate, so activate and potentiate, they're coming across these neurophysiology terms in some of our sort of more textbook guidelines for, working with athletes. But again, to me, they actually don't make much sense in those contexts either.
So let's keep going with this kind of base knowledge before we get into the exciting bit of why people actually doing what they're doing. So what factors affect muscle activation levels?
Okay, so really, if you go back to what affects muscle activation, you have to go back to the fundamental way it's measured and quantified, which is the combination of motor unit recruitment and motor unit action potential discharge number or rate. So if people want to increase activation, they have to increase either motor unit recruitment, the rate coding, or both those in combination. Okay. Those are the two big ones. There are one or two other ones, which I'll mention very briefly after, but those are really the two biggies that you want to be looking after to increase activation. And the two ways to increase motor unit recruitment and rate coding, the first one is muscle force. You have to generate more and more force to drive up motor unit recruitment. It depends on the muscle group as well. Okay, so if you take the adductor pollicis in your hand, a small muscle found in the hand, full of slow twitch fibers, its motor unit recruitment is maximized, completely maximal, at about 30% of MVC. So MVC meaning maximal voluntary contraction. So only 30% of your maximum effort with that muscle, and you've recruited all the muscle fibers in it already. Some of the bigger muscle groups, mixed fibers or type 2 containing fibers, they may take a bit higher forces. So you're probably looking anywhere towards between 75 and 80%, 85% MVC for those. So the larger muscles with the bigger motor units, are larger motor units because they contain more muscle fibers, their motor unit recruitment tends to require more force as well. So it just depends, again, on the muscle group you're talking about. But again, because most sports involve those big locomotory muscle units, quads, hamstrings, glutes, etc., that's going to take higher force levels to get up to the maximal motor unit recruitment. But again, the key thing is it doesn't have to be a complete maximum force, maximum effort to get out all of those motor units involved. And then the second one is the rate coding then. Okay, so as I previously said, motor unit recruitment can be maximized at sub-maximal levels. Most of them are between 50 to 85% MVC, but actually rate coding is much more important than motor unit recruitment for the highest forces that you want to produce as well. But if you intend, that is, you put the effort into trying to develop force, you will get sequentially higher motor unit recruitment and higher rate coding. The other side, or the other option to generating high force, is to develop force rapidly, so speed or power. Okay. The control of that is slightly different. You don't get maximal motor unit recruitment because you don't have time, essentially, to get hold of all of those motor units. And you don't develop maximum force as well. But what you do with a fast or powerful contraction is you do get very, very, very high amount of action potentials discharged or firing rate. Okay, there you go through far higher discharge rates during a fast contraction than you do during a maximal isometric contraction, for example. So in a nutshell, if you want to get high muscle activation, the muscle contractions need to involve high forces or submaximal forces with a high velocity component. So that's what your exercises need to look like if you want to attain high muscle activation by definition. There are other smaller matters like the joint angle. So the joint angle will change the muscle's length. And at different muscle lengths, there are better muscle activation levels. Okay, so we tend, when a joint is fully extended, for example, if you take the knee joint, if it's fully extended out, your legs fully extended, activation doesn't tend to be as high during maximal efforts. Or if it's really flexed, like if you're deep down in a squat, activation isn't quite as high either. You tend to get sort of the best activation of the quads in and around these sort of moderate to slightly long muscle lengths. That pretty much follows the force length relationship of those muscles though. So yeah, the joint angle or muscle length is the other bigger one. And then finally, muscle temperature. Now, muscle temperature has actually the potential to decrease activation rather than increase it. So if the muscle temperature is raised too much, you may get a decrease in activation. But again, The effects, the practical effects of that aren't particularly high unless the muscle temperature is exceedingly high. So joint angle and muscle temperature play very much second fiddle to the big ones, which are muscle force and contraction velocity.
Interesting. When it comes to quantifying it, where has this confusion around EMG come into play?
Yeah,
And can you explain that confusion as well?
Yeah, it's a big one. EMG is a very useful measure. So EMG, like a surface EMG amplitude, that's just your classical sort of large EMG trace that you'll see. That is a global representation of muscle activation. It's more of a mathematical representation of it more than anything. And it contains the EMG amplitude that you see in the EMG readings contains information both on motor unit recruitment and the motor unit firing rate as well. But it is not an exact representation of that because what you need to do to get those numbers out for motor unit recruitment and motor unit firing rate is you need to decompose that surface EMG, which is what quite a lot about where high density EMG, for example, comes into it, and where you've got now mathematical algorithms, etc., and different ways of decomposing and breaking down those EMG signals. So they're quite complex and representative, but I suppose the thing about EMG is, and where a lot of people go wrong, is it's the interpretation of what those amplitudes mean. Because they're affected by so many different factors that you have to account for, and they're affected by the underlying physiology, the metabolic and condition of the muscle and stuff like that. They all affect the neural system. So it's not a very simple, straightforward cause and effect. For example, if you have a high EMG amplitude and you get an even increased one following, and in the next contraction, that contraction mightn't actually be producing any more force. You can get changes in EMG without function. You can get changes in different neural measures without a change in function. But then also you can get a neural change that does match the function. So this is the big thing, is if you look at EMG, I would argue it's meaningless, absolutely meaningless, without other measures to back it up, such as a force measure or something that's trying to show you what function changes as a result of that change in the EMG amplitude. So that's that part. And I suppose what comes along with activation is when practitioners talk about, I'm doing this to increase muscle activation, they don't ever measure it. You will find GPS units, you'll find heart rate monitors, you'll find all sorts of different monitoring tools, but muscle activation seems to be, for some reason, that thing that the people say they're doing, but they don't ever try and quantify it using EMG. But I wouldn't necessarily encourage that either, because, like I said, unless they have a background in it, you need to have such tight controls and processes as part of your EMG methodologies that it's not just something you can decide, I want to do EMG stuff tomorrow, pick up electrodes and then run with it. You have to have a very good background, because the stringentness, if you like, how stringent your EMG methodologies are, very much dictate how good of quality data that you have, and actually what type of inferences that you can make about whatever you're trying to measure. So it really is a minefield. Things changing it all the time as technologies advance too. We're still learning a huge amount of things about the neural system. So it's not just something you can really dip your toe into and dip out again and use here and use there. You need to really be consistently using it.
Not to throw any brands under the bus, but EMG shorts, people have kind of dabbled with them, and I would guess using them, and this is just from a couple of conversations that I had, people are probably wanting to replicate what they've seen in these EMG studies that you mentioned, to rank exercises based on activation.
Yeah.
So they go, okay, that activation for this exercise is higher than that for him or her, therefore we're going to prescribe that, but it's different for him or her, and for them we'll prescribe that. So this kind of ranking system. But what value do they bring based on what you've just said?
I would argue minimal. The big thing about one of the biggest limitations of surface EMG anyway to begin with, no matter how good you are at it, it's based on the skin, and the skin can move relative to the underlying muscle. So that's one of the things you really have to be careful when you're interpreting EMG, surface EMGs, because how close you are to the neuromuscular junction changes the amplitude of the signal on its own, regardless of changes in force. So if your skin is moving at all relative to that, that's changing the amplitude, not anything to do with the exercise you're actually doing. And that happens at the best of times with surface EMG. And I've had this conversation many times. If you have EMG in shorts or in a piece of clothing that's embedded in a fabric, that fabric is also sliding over the skin as well. So how you could have any idea or trying to make any valuable inference between what you're recording through EMG shorts and what's happening in the underlying muscle when you've got skin and fabric, the electrodes sliding all over the place, I don't think you can really make those sorts of calls yet. It's a nice idea, absolutely. But again, you have to be aware of the underlying limitations of what you're measuring and the validity and reliability of those. And if the validity and reliability is poor, it's not worth doing at all, really.
Perfect. Right. So where's this activation or pre-activation? And we'll use them the same. Well, how people use them is interchangeable, but I think from my interpretation, it's the same thing. So this kind of low level, often using bands pre-warm up not only pre-warm up, either inside or on the field. And we've all seen it when we've been watching Sky Sports, and all the bands come out and then do low level exercise and bands go away and they can continue with the warm up. Where, again, I'm asking you, and you may just have, from speaking to people, have a little idea, but where has that come from? Where did that start?
Yeah, again, very difficult to put your finger on the exact origins of it. That practice did kind of come out of left field, between the last 10 to 15 years, and just seems to be even more prevalent. I don't even remember the last time I've seen somebody not using some sort of band to do a warm up. Again, I think it was probably from the sports medicine world. Again, this is not me blaming them, by the way. This is where it's been moved out of context from where it's been used appropriately to out of context and not used appropriately. Again, probably if they've had an injury and they're doing some work around that injury and maybe they've seen banded use as part of that, and probably in the communication, the physiotherapist or doctor may have said they were using this to activate such and such, and they've said, oh, I must need a band to activate this then, or whatever. Again, not being familiar with the definition of what muscle activation is. So I think it's probably come possibly from that world a bit, but yeah, the practice then just falls incredibly short of theoretical rationale. So again, we go back to whether it's muscle activation, pre-activation. I don't like that word because it infers that you're doing something that'll have a cause and effect. You're pre-activating to cause something further down the line. But activation is just a real-time phenomenon, so you don't pre-activate. The only context really you see pre-activation used in biomechanics particularly. So example, if you're sprinting, you'll see just right before maybe ground contact time, like the likes of the gastrocs will activate. as part of preparing for that ground contact time. That's activation prior to an event or prior to the ground contact, but it's not pre-activation as in an actual physiological term or measure or anything like that. So again, if we refer back to the practice where you see the bands being taken out and the exercises that are used, I suppose to be clear, the bands again aren't the problem per se. It's the relative ease or lack of stiffness of the bands, because some bands that are quite tough and stiff and not easily stretched, if you put force and effort against the band that you can barely move, that will activate the muscle, okay. But what we do see in practice often is very, very low level resistance bands being used for the likes of those exercises that aren't challenging the muscle to produce force. They aren't performed with any speed. So again, going back to motor unit recruitment and motor unit firing rate, if you don't do any activity that doesn't require much force or doesn't require much velocity, you aren't actually increasing muscle activation levels at all. They're being low. So that kind of defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do. You've introduced an exercise that is designed to increase activation, where the exercise and the manner in which you carry it out aren't going to achieve that. So it's kind of it's fallen flat of its purpose essentially. So you're kind of wasting your time. And following on from that, also is the specificity of it. When we look to a lot of the big gross locomotor motions, jumping, sprinting, changes of direction, and we have our EMG research done on those types of activities. Those activities get you much higher muscle activation than any of those band activities. Those band activities usually quantified anywhere between 20 and 40%, the slams, monster walks, all that sort of thing. So the EMG activity is relatively poor in that, whereas we look at the EMG activity during those big locomotor events and exercises, and it's much higher. It's 60% to 100% or even slightly more. So again, you're actually sacrificing something that is more aligned to what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be running in a game and you can run to activate your muscles and increase the muscle activation, why on earth would you try and do an isolated exercise to replace that gives you low level activation? And if running's going to be a part of your warm up anyway and supersedes all of the band work, again, what has that band work achieved? So I can't see any other outcome of this other than you're just wasting your time. I will say though, that's if you're definitely trying to increase muscle activation. Some of this is linked to mobility, immobilizing joints and increasing range of motion, which is absolutely fine if that's what you're using it to do. But you can't say you're using these exercises and perform them in the manner that you do for muscle activation, because that doesn't work. That doesn't fit the known processes or known ways which you need to be able to do to increase muscle activation.
But from the exercise that we commonly see, the bands around the ankles, side stepping, alternate legs going forwards, backwards, if the aim is mobility and they're just calling it activation, is that actually doing anything for mobility anyway? The kind of exercise that we're seeing?
Yeah. Those exercises, those bands can be used to increase mobility. There's no, that's it. So if it's for mobility and you're using them, absolutely no problem. If you've thrown the word activation in there to sound more impressive to people, well, you're either one for confusing them or you're just doing it to sound smart with either. But yeah, if you use them for mobility, to increase mobility, that there's no issue there at all. So it's either a name thing or your actual what you're trying to achieve is slightly different.
In terms of injured players, and like you said, that potentially transfer from sports medicine into the kind of sports performance world, how injured or how immobile does someone have to be for those kind of exercises to be actually useful?
Well, it all depends on the nature of the injury. Muscle, tendon, bone, whatever. We have no issue at all with activating any of our muscles. There is no problem in voluntary activation of muscles. That's been shown across from the largest to the smallest muscles. Humans have no issues at all doing that. In my experience, as long as you do a proper, warm up, again, if you're coming back from injury and you're returning to sport, there shouldn't be any real, you would need to be in fairly bad shape or have a very, very specific ongoing injury that's going to affect muscle activation, that's going to require any specific activation. Yeah, again, it all depends on the nature of the injury, but you will regain, or you should regain in most cases from most injuries, full neuromuscular properties back again. So to actually have to say, Jimmy's coming back from this injury, he needs to go over here to this area and do these sets of exercises over here. Not really my experience anyway. I've never seen much from that, and certainly the handover from sports medicine to sports science, I've never really been handed say, oh, you need to really work on the activation of this. Yeah, so as long as they're good at their motor control is good, they're kinematically performing the exercise well and stuff like that, there's no real need for any of these. And you can increase muscle activation in terms of preparing the muscle, but you can't increase your voluntary activation by doing that. Your voluntary activation levels are set and they're pretty much maximal. So, you don't suddenly go over and above what you're capable of doing. That's already pretty much set. So you're just getting yourself prepped appropriately to produce what you're able to produce.
And why did the glutes get the focus? They get all the good band work that everyone's doing.
Yeah, a disproportionate amount of the work does seem to focus around the glutes. And again, I don't know if this has come from sleepy glutes being mentioned at different times, or glutes need to wake up, or the glutes need to fire and stuff like that. My think it probably has come from a bit of that, again, being taken completely out of context. But when you look at like sleepy glutes literature and stuff like that, that's not athletes reporting those problems. That's office workers. That's people who are not habitually particularly physically active. So again, to try and draw literature on trying to get glutes to fire because they might be sleepy or something like that into high performing professional or amateur athletes, it just sits way out of whack. So I think that possibly some of it come from, but again, the glutes themselves have absolutely no problems in their voluntary activation. They are our big locomotory muscles, our big powerful hip extensors. So they would be in big dips if those didn't fire properly on command. From an evolutionary point of view, or even from anything else, if we can't run on demand, we'd be in trouble, no matter what our situation is. So there's no issues with the glutes whatsoever, unless you've suffered something particularly, serious or specific to the glutes. But again, what I'd written previously is even if what happens if there may be some sort of gluteal inhibition to the muscle, that's being caused by something else. And when that something else has been resolved, the gluteal inhibition is removed and full activation returns. So again, it's not an activation problem, it's a secondary activation problem to some other issue. So yeah, that's what I mean is when somebody comes back to sport, and they're ready to come on to do anything specific. No, because that primary issue should have been resolved. And if that primary issue is resolved, the inhibition or whatever it was, which would require activation, is gone as well. And you can go about your normal business of a warm up.
I'm not winding you up now, but I'm going to ask you a question. So we are going to go play football. We're going to do a particular activity, change direction, agility, whatever it might be, jump, in a sporting context. If I don't do an activation, what a part of this activation warm up with the bands, the sidewalks, the monster walks, all that kind of stuff, what effect, I'm not taking the piss here, what effect is there going to be if I do them monster walks, side steps with the bands, the kind of bands that we see that get sold here, there, and everywhere? What effect is that going to give us on our activity?
Virtually zero. The effect size, if you like, you've born from statistics, or how big the practical effect is virtually zero, because if you go into doing those activities, like I've said, you've already superseded the muscle activation in those activities is already well superseded what you were doing and with the bands. So this is the other sort of really funny and ironic thing about using the bands. Say somebody says, I'm using activation because I want to induce PAP, post-activation potentiation, or even PAPE, which is post-activation performance enhancement. The conditioning contraction for those in order to get those increased performances, they have to be of a high intensity. So if you read the literature, they call them conditioning contractions. The conditioning contraction has to be of a high intense nature, and by high intense they mean high force. And of course, to get high force, you need high activation. So it is very ironic that when people say the outcome they want to get is post-activation potentiation, PAP or PAPE, they're using low intense exercises to try and get that, which is exactly as a conditioning contraction, which is exactly the opposite of what they need. So yeah, the effect of those low intensity exercises on subsequent performance are nil.
So in terms of an alternative, the alternative is a good warm up. The alternative is higher intensity activity should you be going for post-activation potentiation.
Yeah, so everybody was probably getting it right 10 to 15 years ago before all this started happening. A nice progressive overload in the intensity in terms of muscle force or speed at which you perform your classic actions of running, jumping, changing direction, etc., etc. So as long as you move steadily and sensibly, again, no warm up. Nobody says, okay, first thing we're going to do in a warm up is I want you to run 100% there for 50 meters. Nobody's ever doing that. We do our build up runs and stuff like that. And because you get all the other beneficial effects, the metabolic effects, the muscle temperature effects, all of that as well. It's not just about the neural system. So as long as you give a nice progressive in terms of intensity and speed to your warm-up activities, and you integrate some specific stuff, you'll get, PAP's a bit different because classic PAP has to be measured by a super maximal stimulation of the muscle. Okay, so nobody's got that quite equipment knocking around. But if you just talk about PAPE then, which is just an increase in performance of a voluntary contraction by a person a few minutes after an activation or conditioning contraction, you're going to get all that on just those actions. You're going to get your post-activation performance enhancement from the sprints, the running, jumping, changes of direction, because they all involve the intent to move quickly or with the maximal forces. So, drop down in a nutshell. No need to stress about anything else.
Good place to round it off there. It's conclusive. The bands will still get sold, Gerard. There'll be still hundreds of them pinging it out all over the place, breaking, people want replacements. but I don't think we can do any more than what we've done here, or what you've done here. So if anyone wants to read any more about the kind of hardcore physiology on this topic, or something a little bit more lighthearted but relevant to sports practitioners, apart from the 2 articles you've done for Sportsmith on this, where would you guide people?
Yeah, within those articles, there's 2 references. A couple. Any of the work, Roger Nova is a world leader in it. Dario Farina, for example, as well. There is a lot of DT Sale too from the sort of the older stuff. There is plenty. Jonathan Follins and oh my gosh, Alan Williams. Alan Williams from Manchester. Matt done a great review on neuromuscular function and stuff as well, and adaptations at the muscle level. I think 15 years ago. So there's plenty of that knocking about. And also the International Society of Biomechanics, they have a great tools page and stuff where they give presentations on EMG, what it is, interpretations and stuff too. So plenty of resources out there for people to familiarize themselves with.
And they'll have so much time to dive into those resources because they'll be saving 15 or 20 minutes pre-training because they're not doing the band work.
Yeah, that's for me. It's such a big plus for a coach for you to sit there and go, I'm going to clear 15 minutes out of your schedule now, and you've all this what in every single session perfectly. So it is fantastic, and they do appreciate that, certainly.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you for and I've thanked you before, but I'll thank you again for the 2 articles that you wrote for Sportsmith, because they're superb and they've gone down really, really well with the audience. Clearly, this is a topic that's of interest. And thank you for the last hour. It's been really good to chat and put a face to a email address or a text. And look forward to keeping in touch.
No, not at all, mate. Pleasure at all. Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it myself.
Thanks, mate. Speak soon.
All right. Take it easy, Rob. Bye.